Okay, I think we're ready to get started again. Hope you had an opportunity to fuel up at the break. This is essentially one session now from now until lunch, and I'll just mention that if there's anybody who would like to sit down the front row, in the beginning of the day we had the seats down here reserved, some seats reserved for our panelists, but they're all freed up now, so if you prefer to sit closer, feel free. If you were sitting in the front row and you really want to be in the back, go ahead, Nini, it's okay. Oh, excellent. So at this part of the day, I'm going to give a little overview of how I see our progress to date in this whole process. And I want to start by saying that this is not just the process of the Alliance for Arts and Culture. It's really a community process, and we are convening conversations and taking somewhat of a coordinating role, but it's really based on what we're hearing in those conversations and what people are telling us about their interests, their perspectives, the directions that they see that could move us forward. And so keep with that in mind. What I'm reporting on is essentially my view on what has been happening, not so much the Alliance's draft of where we are to date as a policy framework. So this is just a little history. And first of all, I'll reflect back again on how we got started on this conversation. You heard a little bit about Arts Access 73. Over the last several years of the Alliance's Arts Summits, which were focused usually on professional development topics and a sort of a variety of topics affecting arts and culture as a sector, we were always coming back to the conversation on cultural policy, the perceived lack of cultural policy that guides provincial decisions, and need for a more coordinated idea from the community about how we would see cultural policy that can help to guide provincial relationship with arts and culture. And so last year's Arts Summit 2013, we focused entirely on that topic to get that conversation started. We talked about a lot of the issues that can feed into the idea of cultural policy. And today I'm going to talk about the ideas and outcomes that emerged at the summit last year, other dialogues that took place over the past year, some of the defining issues of our work so far, and we'll talk about the new partnerships and the next steps that we can take, starting with our sessions this afternoon and our breakouts. Our Arts Summit 2013 goals were to educate ourselves about policymaking, to share visions for cultural policy in BC, and to develop strategies for the year ahead. And so when we look at cultural policy, the idea of cultural policy is something that kind of needed to be defined and can be a difficult thing to define. And I would say that my learning on this is that cultural policy can be anything that is an official act of a government that's affecting culture. That can be an expression of cultural policy. It could also be more formally expressed through legislation, through budget appropriations, through the establishment of government agencies. So some examples of cultural policy we live with right now include the BC Arts Council Act or the formation of Creative BC. These are significant pieces of legislation and structure that the government has put in place to guide its relationship with arts and culture. Government might also have in place cultural policy in pieces without necessarily any one overarching document. And I think that that kind of overarching tie-in is what we've been craving. And so we're really looking now at what is a cultural policy framework. We heard from the social policy framework discussion about how they're shaping that as a tool, essentially a set of overall priorities and directions that relate to the sector. So in our case, directions for culture that are very broad and high level, that provide some consistency, however, in how plans might flow out regardless of what ministry they sit in, and tying together and linking the plans that are in place across various subsectors and various ministries by having common overarching priorities. So it's an expression of the provincial government's overall relationship to arts and culture across the province and across ministries. Last year, under the category of educating ourselves, we compiled a lot of research documents, other policy documents, examples from many other jurisdictions, and you can find these on our artssummit.ca website, which when we set it up last year, we put all that material there. We ask that even now, a year later, if you're seeing other documents, examples of policy frameworks or discussions or research that can inform our ongoing conversation, that we can add this. And please let us know, and we can add it to this resource. This is an ongoing, available tool for the entire community to see all of this brought together. We're looking at essentially a framework being broad principles, recognition of social and economic benefits of culture. These are some of the things that are commonly linked in through the examples that you'll see on this website. Recognizing connections between culture and the government's policies and strategies for First Nations, for multiculturalism, for tourism, for economic development, health, and education. And there are often, in many of these examples, defining statements such as culture as essential to life in a society, or culture's accessibility to all citizens, and the government's responsibility to support and promote culture. So you'll see that these themes are common across a lot of cultural policy frameworks that are in place in other places and in discussions, and certainly these are common themes in the discussions that we've had so far. We looked last year at a particular model of New Brunswick's cultural policy, and Richard Hornsby, who was a part of the team that put that together, was here. Alison Turner from Alberta was also here to talk about the Alberta experience. And again, a lot of common links that we'll see when you look at cultural policy frameworks across the country. I see a lot of parallels between the New Brunswick model and Saskatchewan, for example. Oh, that timing thing is an ongoing issue. I'll be aware now. It's a good cue, though. We learned in this discussion about the various examples in other provinces, and we particularly dug into whether this kind of framework can be appropriate for us. It breaks down also the big topic of what is culture, and we're going to come back to that a little later in our panel discussion. So we moved into the conversation that the creative industries and their work on development toward what became Creative BC. We heard from this group again this morning, and the continuing work that they're doing together to advance the goals of that agency and its effectiveness. And overall, we heard from a lot of people in our summit last year. This little list and group of pictures doesn't even come close to representing all the people who shared their experiences, who stood up here at this podium and talked about their community snapshots from their perspectives, and all of those pieces that help to frame our breakout discussions. The whole agenda of the summit broke into two main themes. Most of our discussions, the presentations, and all of our breakout sessions really broke into the themes and content for what would work in a BC cultural policy framework, and also the strategies for province-wide engagement, and looking for what else is missing that we could see would be important in BC that maybe wasn't represented in some of those examples that we looked at. We heard from many presenters on their experiences in community-engaged arts practice, some people whose work is greatly focused on the social benefit and transformative community impact of arts and culture. We talked about the links between culture and other sectors that affect the lives of British Columbians, and particularly some of those that are also priorities for the provincial government. And then we moved into our breakout sessions, and with these, kept them on these two themes. On the first day, we asked questions around themes and content of the cultural policy framework. The second day, we focused more on the engagement and the process moving forward. And what we learned from these questions helped to set the context for everything else that we've been doing over the past year, other conversations that we've held, and each new conversation has really informed us, helped to refine our thinking about what we're hearing and how we can process that information and share it back to the community. So the question of what makes it special to BC, what is different here that would need to be reflected in how we think about a cultural policy framework compared to other provinces. And our culture of place came up very prominently in our discussions about what makes BC different. And it's a bit about how our place includes the urban and rural and remote communities, how we need to recognize the diversity of views that come from our geography, that culture can actually mean something different for each of these communities, and that was important to recognize. Our islands, our mountains, the coastal communities, interior and northern communities, the natural landscape and its resources also drive the economy, which creates a unique political perspective in many places. And our identity as British Columbians is often shaped by our physical, and some would say philosophical, distance from the rest of Canada. When we're talking about the diversity of people in BC, we recognize that all parts of BC are influenced by diverse perspectives. We have a particular connection to our First Nations influence and the Asia-Pacific influence. And our youth tend to be less restrained by the boundaries of previous generations and are in some ways creating their own understanding of cultural identity. We think often that our sense of history is distinct from the rest of the country, and that makes a lot of sense when you consider a bit of an uncomfortable relationship with our own history around our relationships with First Peoples, our history of colonization, and our recent very fast evolving sense of immigration, and how our entire society is made up and how we define it and describe it and how we interact with each other. We have an economy that is driven by the province's resources, and that has an influence on how we consider how we relate to each other and relate our art to our economy. And we have a sense of how we do things a little differently out here, which shapes our values in a way that might be a little bit distinct in BC. The strongest themes from the breakout sessions, these were emerging over and over, so those things that were repeatedly coming forward and that have been also reflected in discussions since then, roundtables and so on, linking arts and culture to economic prosperity is a fairly common theme, not one that everyone agrees should be a significant priority, but one that most people identify as part of the connection between culture and our case in the community, our case with government, and our case connecting with other community partners. Ensuring consistency and transparency in funding is another theme that, of course, comes from our recent history of kind of volatile and in some cases damaging shifts in levels of funding and understanding the process and the fairness and consistency of the allocation of funds that are made available for culture. It's an issue that's very real to many organizations, and somehow people really want this to be addressed in a policy framework. What are our principles around transparency and consistency? Integrating culture in education, in social services, in health and wellness, understanding that culture plays a role in the successful delivery of services in many, many areas and enhances quality of life in British Columbian communities through culture's connection in all of these areas. A big priority that comes up over and over in many ways, and that I heard a lot in my participation in the Where Next conference, are issues around diversity and inclusion and community cohesion, and many different ways of discussing those topics, but certainly it's very top of mind when we're looking at the impact of arts and culture and how we connect with a common message. There's the recognition of diversity as such a huge part of our cultural identity. The need to support creation, research, innovation, the stimulative effect of the government's role in arts and culture is that support piece, and something that is very much focused on the professional arts sector, and we hear very much from that component. And finding ways of setting goals and measuring outcomes, that the framework needs to establish that as a guiding point for cultural policy, that it is important to have guiding measures. How do we know when we're successful? How do we measure how we're achieving the goals we set out, and how much further we can go and how fast? I want to take a few minutes and actually look at what the provincial government already says about arts and culture, and we may not be really familiar with this. Sometimes these things come through in gigantic documents that are, and this, in this case, this is the ministry service plan, which is a piece of the overall provincial budget every year. The outline of each ministry's plan to allocate the funds that are in that budget includes a strategic context. It's a narrative that introduces the whole thing, and then the breakdown of the funds. So in this year's strategic context for the Ministry of Community, Sport and Cultural Development, this section, ministry programs encourage artists, arts organizations, and the public to work together to increase participation, improve quality of life, create strong community identity, and contribute to local economies. Still within the strategic context, the dynamic cultural mosaic celebrates the richness of our Indigenous heritage as well as the cultures new to the province. I'm reading this all out because I just want to make sure it's really clear if you can't read from the back. Funding from ministry programs, community gaming grants, and BC Arts Council help communities create opportunities for people to participate in arts and cultural activities. These include theatre, dance, music, visual arts and crafts, museums, galleries, performance venues, and professional arts in communities across the province. So all of this is embedded in the documents that come out with the budget. And when we're looking at for statements, clarifications of the government sense of its responsibilities and its role in supporting arts and culture, here's where we can see some of that already articulated, the current state, if you will. And then this piece came out last week. So this is in the Premier's letter to each minister. This is from the letter to Minister Oakes, and there are several points laid out that the Premier is asking for the minister to deliver in the year ahead. So for this year, 2014 going to 2015, the Premier asks work with the Ministry of Jobs, Tourism and Skills Training to ensure that cultural assets are being maximized to drive tourism opportunities in British Columbia, and develop and present to Cabinet a plan to grow BC's creative economy and creative workforce. These are just two of the specific outcomes that our ministry is being asked to deliver on behalf of the entire government, in addition to the ongoing programs that are supported through that budget. And so we look to our overall goals and the road ahead and what's needed in our engagement of communities across the province, moving these conversations forward, and we recognize the connections that are necessary between artists and cultural workers, the government, and other partners in the communities. We heard about in the social policy framework what some of those partners can represent when it could be municipalities, it could be other agencies that are endorsing the work of the arts and culture sector, the importance and the value to their sectors. And we also heard from the minister her desire to work with the sector in the creation of what she called a cultural strategy for British Columbia. And that, to me, is a really significant indication that there is a genuine interest in the conversation, in incorporating the input of the sector and finding terminology that's working within her view of her mandate as a minister. So as we work on this together, the Arts Summit led to something where, because the summit's like a 1 or 2 day thing, what do we call the rest of this that's going on through the year? And we're calling it BC Creative Convergence. We gave it a name. Kevin came up with it. He's good at naming things, giving it that title so that we can call the process this convergence. It's about collaboration. It's about bringing together the ideas and the conversations that are guiding us toward a goal of a framework. The steering committee that was set up last year is basically kind of that overarching help us to set out what we're going to try to accomplish through the year. The steering committee itself basically made itself redundant by saying, okay, what we really need are the specific committees around documentation. So it took us a long time actually to document everything that came out of last year's Art Summit. It was the first conversations that we were convening in this way, and because it was so dense, the information, there was so much there. As you can remember if you were here last year, we had report backs that were the distillation of conversations that had gone on at 20 different tables for 45 minutes, and then we'd get 2-minute report backs or 1-minute report backs from each table, because we had to really move it along and just hear the most important, most prominent ideas that came from those tables. But there was so much more underneath that, and we tried to capture as much as we could in the documentation, and then use that to feed our engagement process. The documentation of those breakouts last year gave us a set of sort of principles for the engagement process. So we started into this plan of community roundtables. We got a sort of a pilot run, a trial run, which was a real learning experience for us with the Victoria meetings that we had last month. And we continue to get guidance and advice on how to carry forward with that. We're so happy that Arts BC has agreed to work with us on the community roundtables going forward, and their commitment really takes advantage of the resources that they have already in place. So their organization is divided into, is it 9 or 10 regions? 9? 10? Something like that. 9. So each of these regions is committed to hosting at least one roundtable and convening the groups that come from that region. And so we have this great opportunity for getting input from the community, representing the different regional perspectives across the province. So this is a really key tool that was made clear last year, is a very important perspective to keep at the table. In addition to that, we're looking at the possibility of community roundtables that are convened by sector or by communities of interest in, so by sector I mean sort of subsectors or disciplines within arts and culture, and other communities of interest that might be other sectors who could be partners with us, who have links to arts and culture, who can help us to understand what they need from arts and culture and how they value arts and culture as a part of their fabric. And mentioning fabric, by the way, I should I just want to recognize Sam Brad, who's doing graphic recording of all these sessions. This was another part of our documentation of last year's conversations. Sam captured them on 6 or 8 gigantic panels like that, which are posted out in the exhibit hall. That's from last year's conversations. They're available in high-res versions on the website, so you can look back to those and sort of understand what was the context of when this breakout topic was happening, how were people responding to that, as represented by Sam's graphic recording. He took some of those key ideas from that, and in our conversations we identified a number of them that he sort of reworked the illustrations, what you're seeing in this presentation here. And in these conversations we were understanding, and he's represented it better than I've presented it, but just to go back here, the idea that not only do we have potential to have a framework that looks like sort of the quadrants of subsectors that's represented in that New Brunswick policy, we also really have so many things that when you look at those ways of defining the sector, but then we add in all these other diverse viewpoints, the urban versus rural, the diversity issues, and all of the ways that things cross over, it was being seen more and more as a tapestry of issues that are interrelated, interconnected, and that are sometimes difficult to just lay out in words. But Sam's done a great job of laying out this sort of this weave of issues that tie together threads that link from urban areas into rural and remote areas, that of links that cross the lines of different peoples and histories, and ultimately, it's a tapestry that is put together by all of these conversations. So I just wanted to sort of jump back and recognize that, and thank Sam for his hung. So what I'd like to go to now, first I'll maybe take a short pause. If anyone would like, I'm just going to keep the eye on the time here. If anyone would like to take an opportunity now for just some questions so far, but then we're going to introduce a panel, and we're going to talk about something that I feel is still a very unresolved kind of topic in the overall conversation. So any questions so far before we move on to that? Big questions? Okay, good. So we'll come back. You can have more at the